Welcome to our fourth and final series on reading group series on the theory of economic development by Schumpeter. We'll be covering chapters 5 and 6 with Carmen Contreras from the Catholic University of Chile. She just completed her PhD on innovation at Oxford University, and she'll be covering chapter 5. And newly doctored Beniamino Callegari will be talking about chapter 6. He's at BI Norwegian University. You've heard him speak throughout this session. We're excited to discuss these two chapters with you today, and I'll give the floor over to Carmen to begin about talking about chapter 5 with us.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Mary. Can you hear me well, right?
Yes.
Good. So chapter 5 discuss the interest on capital and kind of like sets the ground for chapter 6 on business cycles, which is actually the role of the money market and capital and credit is very important, as we will discuss later. So the problem, as in any chapter of Schumpeter's book, for me, was that, as we discussed previously, that, he's not actually giving you right away what he considers to be his theory on interest, but he just kind of like gives you bits and that of discussion of other theories, and at the end say, but this is not relevant in our case. So it's a little bit hard to actually get to his theory on interest. But our version has preliminary remarks that in this edition, Schumpeter actually discussed a little bit of comments that he got from the first edition in this respect. And it's, I think it's, I will comment on the structure, and then I will try to summarize the Schumpeter's theory of interests, so we can start discussing this. So first, in these preliminary remarks, Schumpeter clarifies the difference for him between the different types of interests. He does not deny that there is interest on consumption loans, but he says that it's not a relevant part of development because this also happens on the circular flow, and it actually does not create development. So he leaves it from the beginning very clear that what he considered interest, and when he talks about interest, is productive interest, or the interest on productive loans. Then he also mentioned that he bases a lot of his theory on the theory of interest developed by von Backert. Sorry that I cannot pronounce that correctly. However, he said that his theory has a premise about why the present purchasing power it's valued more than future purchasing power. And von Bakker theory is based on the discounting of future consumption. So it's more about the traditional view and of discounting intertemporal consumption. But he said that it is not the case, that this difference emerged from development. It emerged from the entrepreneurial process. And he said that any interest theory of interest needs to answer 3 questions, like what is the source that generates interest? What is the reason why this value or interest occurs? And how the interest it maintains through time. So it's flows permanently. Then it goes to describe and discuss different sources and bases of interest. So in doing this, he mentioned certain areas that, even though they're not certain circumstances in which interests emerge, however, is not necessarily directly related to entrepreneurship. And he says this happens, however, this is not that common to actually explain, well, the existence of interest in the economy overall, and in a permanent basis. So he said there are other cases that actually we will mention a couple of them, but they explain the existence of temporal interest, but not permanent. And finally, he recognizes that the difference in valuation of goods today over the consumption of goods tomorrow can emerge from the value of land, not necessarily the value of the uses of the land, and also monopoly positions. But as I told you, Schumpeter left this aside because it do not actually explain the permanent, the last part, the permanent flow of interest. So finally, he explains how interest is spread, presents his theory that interest emerged from the entrepreneurial process, and explain how this interest spread from this case to the whole economy and the role of money market in this process. So let's try I will try to summarize what I understood from Schumpeter's theory of interest. So the main theorem for Schumpeter's theory of interest is that interest attaches to money and not to goods. So it's a monetary phenomenon. And that interests are surpluses of the value of products above the value of the quantities of production, goods embodied in them. So it's the value of the products is higher than the cost of producing the product. And in the circular flow, there is no productive interest because the whole value product must be imputed to the original factors. And there is not a permanent net income other than wages and rent. And any differences will disappear through competitions and imputation. So without development, still it might be some cases where the value of the goods are higher than the cost. And in this case, it could be because of unintentional or unexpected variations, conditions of distress, superabundance that was not foreseen, and some errors. But these are temporary and not actually explain a continuous flow of interest. And also, this difference can emerge from monopolistic positions. In the case of the value of land, land can have multiple uses and can be used always ad infinitum. So when you want to sell the land, you need to input in its price, of course, all its value or potential uses. So in this case, the value of the land will be higher than the value of the current use. But he mentions that the market for land will only emerge and will happen with development, as he mentions in chapter 2. In the case of the monopolistic position, Schumpeter argues that natural monopolies also generate income, and because of this, they're also in a similar situation of land, but they're also a case when the monopolistic position came from patents or permanent patents in this case. Sorry. However, if the patents are not perpetual, probably this interest will be temporal as well. And then also there is the valuation of goods for consumers, like consumers valuate goods higher today than tomorrow. And this could, according to Schumpeter, could be explained when the good itself increases its value over time, like a land, a forest, or wine, for example, or when there is an expected increase in demand. However, he said that this last part, an increase in demand, only happens with development. So again, at the end, everything could also be traced to development. But then there's also the main event of development, that is the entrepreneurial process. And actually, he goes to discuss that interest or productive interests owe their existence to development in two instances. First, entrepreneurial profit, because the new way of producing goods generates a profit, and then the interest on that profit will spread through the economy, or because there is a repercussions of this entrepreneurial process, the increase of demand for certain goods that emerges from development. He mentions that these two sources of interest are temporal. However, the entrepreneurial profits are continuously maintained, right? As long as there are entrepreneurial processes happening on the economy. In an economic system in full development, entrepreneurial profits is constantly created because there are potentially infinite entrepreneurial possibilities, right? However, the credit for these possibilities are more limited, and we will discuss this later. So Schumpeter then formulates 6 propositions. The first, that interest flow essentially from the surplus values between the value and the cost of a product. Then the surplus values in development emerge from entrepreneurial profits. All surplus values of goods will be temporary, and the interest in an economic category only arises in an exchange economy. Here he mentions that in a communist economy, entrepreneurs won't have to pay for the resources, and therefore they will not have to ask for credit. Then the 5th proposition is that entrepreneurs' profits is essentially interest on capital, because entrepreneurs must borrow from capitalists to generate their new venture, and they will pay from their own capital or their own profit that credit. And interest is an element in the price then of purchasing power, regarded as means of control of production goods. So you will have to control production goods in order to make a new venture. For that, you need purchasing power today, you need credit that you get from capitalists, and then you have to pay interest for that purchasing power that comes from the entrepreneur's profit. So from this point, Schumpeter discusses the relation of interest in money market. So now that he established that interest emerges in the case of entrepreneurs pursuing their ventures, and the profits that they get, from that profit, they have to pay the credits that they need in order to actually pursue their ventures. Given that interest emerges from entrepreneurial profit, and entrepreneurs need present purchasing power to buy production goods, and generate a larger quantity of purchasing power in the future. Then the entrepreneurs will value today to have the money to actually buy the production goods highly than what their cost, and therefore they will be willing to pay a premium on that money. So again, the sum of money today is the means to obtain a bigger sum of money tomorrow. But then he said, well, in the circular flow, well, they could be capitalist that actually borrows the entrepreneur to the entrepreneur. But in development, we will have the interaction not only between entrepreneurs and capitalists, but between entrepreneurs and bankers. And the bankers actually are the ones that supply the credit in the money market and aggregate, right, the supply from savings and from capitalists. And he mentions again that the equilibrium interest rate will be reached in the regular way that any market reaches its equilibrium with the marginal cost of supply and demand. And however, he mentions that given that there are almost limitless possibilities for entrepreneurial ventures, but there is a limited supply of credit, then it will be natural that the interest rate will always be positive. And there are some entrepreneurs that at the end will leave the market and will not pursue their ventures because the interest rate is too high for their own idea. From this point, the demand for credit and the interest from entrepreneurs, paid by entrepreneurs, will spread throughout the economy. So it will reach not only capitalists, but also workers that saves their money around the economy. This happens through, for what I understood, as in the same process of the money multiplier discussed in traditional theories in economics. So this is what I understood from this chapter. And I have some questions that I would like to ask you or discuss with you, because actually I don't have an answer for them. So the original book was written in 1911. So this, I understand that this is when still gold standard was in place. So I'm not sure if any would change of his theory in the current conditions in the monetary market. So that's an open question. Then my second question was about all this Schumpeter's theory of interest is based on the real economy, but we know that in the financial side, on the market side, the speculation can lead to real crisis, but probably then this would be discussed also later because it's related to the business cycle chapter. And then my question is, is there a relationship between the monetary policy and innovation, given the importance of the interest rate then in the entrepreneurial process? And if it's so, should be coordinated the monetary policy with innovation policies, and in which way? Or actually it shouldn't, because they're completely related but are not necessarily aligned or shouldn't be aligned. And And finally, yeah, is this relationship presented by Schumpeter something that we could use to justify the government intervention in the innovation and entrepreneurship events through credits or subsidies. So I don't know, I think that probably it's better to open the floor.
Do you want to start? Maybe we can start with the first question, because 2, 3, and 4, I think, really link really nicely with chapter 6, right? I guess.
Yes, that's true.
So maybe we first discuss on like if the theory of interests, his theory of interest would change in relation if understanding with gold standard being in place or not. What do you think, Carmen?
Yeah, I'm really not sure if it will change something. I think that the fact that now we don't have, of course, the gold standard in place makes it more easy to create several types of credit, right? More complex in the financial market. That is actually the risk that Schumpeter is foreseeing later, right? But then if this situation can be more risky in that sense, I don't know if there is like a prescription that Schumpeter would take.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting that he doesn't say anything about gold at all. I think in the chapters, and this could even be linked about into his discussion in chapter 2 about his theory of value, which we talked a bit in chapter 1 and chapter 2. Or at least that's the way that I see it, that it really links back to his ideas of on where value comes from and what is money. Beniamino, can I ask you what you think on this, since you discussed this in chapter 2 as well?
On this thing, it's actually a very interesting question, and Marcello Messori investigated the question in quite some details in some recent contributions, in which he essentially restate in a formal form the Schumpeterian theory of interest, in particular the theory of the determination of the rate of interest. Under gold standard settings and under pure fiat monetary settings. So essentially from that analysis, we can see that the gold standard is relevant for the theory of the determination of the rate of interest. It has some impact there, but it is not relevant for the theory of the Schumpeterian theory of interest itself. So the fundamental cause of interest. So that is not impacted at all. The determination of the rate, however, it is.
And can you
like the average interest rate, right, in the economy?
Yeah, exactly. But you see here, Schumpeter spent most of his time trying to establish why interest exists at all as an economic phenomenon, and what is its fundamental cause, rather than determining its rate. Also because you needed to have some institutional analysis in order to decide that, because as we have said, for example, the existence of a gold standard is impactful for that sort of determination, but it is not for the fundamental cause of interest.
So that's good. Yeah, there was a question that I had when I read it.
Now let's see if I don't know if anybody wants to go back into this. I'll throw it out there, but if it's unpopular, it's okay. So we finally see back again the theory of imputation in this chapter, which we haven't seen since chapter 1. So imputation comes back into here, and I'm curious to see how you see it play a role in this chapter and how imputation is a factor in his theory of it.
Yeah, when I read it, was more about, well, he recognizes that interest emerges from a difference, right, between the valuation of goods and the cost. So it says, well, if that is the case, it might be one of the reasons could be that imputation is not working properly, right? And so he goes and mentioned that the case that, what is it? That where imputation would be not actually doing what they should do is actually with the case of land, for example. And it's because imputation with competition will eliminate any difference between the value and the cost of any product. So if it's not eliminating this difference, it could be because there is a problem with imputation. And he then goes to explain. Sorry, let me check my notes. And he mentions different alternatives. The first is that because there is a labor power differences, but he says that it's not really important this because he does not count labor as a product of the means of subsistence of the labor and the laborer and his family. So I'm not quite sure about this. So I don't know. What do you think? And he also mentions that maybe, it's about the exploitation theory presented by Marx, but he also says that it's not relevant in his case. So I don't know, what do you think about that?
I think
maybe Mary's.
No, go ahead.
I just want to say that in general, here imputation is brought forward to discuss and to close all potential alternatives to Schumpeter's own theory of interest, and to discuss the problem of the value of land. And that's quite important. Also, regarding the wages of labor, essentially the idea is that if labor as a service was somehow produced itself, so imputation could take out these net returns that wages are, right? So wages would essentially disappears, but it doesn't work because imputation cannot work for human beings. So there is a difference, and then there is the entire discussion on the difference between imputation and computation, which is quite complicated. But at the same time, essentially, this is all to say that in a perfect competition scenario with perfect knowledge, and that is much more important than perfect competition, actually, but the perfect knowledge of the value and the returns associated to each economic activity, then imputation take out all these extra net income that might be temporarily generated. So that is mostly used in his attempt to identify what could be a fundamental source that keeps springing eternal and that is not immediately subject to the imputation magic. So, and this is why he end up with development.
Yeah.
Well, why don't we move towards maybe something that bridges between 5 and 6? I think your last three questions are a great bridge to that, and also really interesting, both in terms of I think one of the things that Schumpeter is very well known for is business cycles, and I think question two adds many layers to this, right? So I'm gonna kind of I think so. I think it's a good question to ask about how speculation affects innovation, and I'm going to throw in here maybe to make Ben happy. Also, uncertainty, and though Schumpeter doesn't talk about that directly, he does provide a way of kind of thinking about or at least combining uncertainty into his theory. So, what are your thoughts on this idea of how financial speculation affects innovation, entrepreneurship, and Schumpeter's model?
Well, actually, what he mentions is the interest includes some uncertainty, but it's not like the whole economy uncertainty, but the particular uncertainty of the projects of each entrepreneur. So he includes that in the interests. He mentions that part. But yeah, the like systemic uncertainty, he does not mention something about that particularly. And for me, when I was reading the last part about when he brings up the bankers and not necessarily the capitalists, there's when this question emerged for me. It's like, well, but bankers are not only an intermediary. He mentions this here that at the end the theory is not only his theory, but others that the banker just function as an intermediary. But we know that is not necessarily the case, especially now with the sophistication of the financial markets. So the speculation, I think that there could be two ways of seeing this. There is the pure financial speculation, and the other is that the speculation about the entrepreneurial ventures, right? Like you think that this will work or not, depending on the risk. But the pure financial speculation probably generates an effect on the average interest rate in the economy that might lead to dropping some entrepreneurial projects that could be beneficial for the economy. Finally, I think that for me, that would be something that I could take from Schumpeter's model, but I'm not sure. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree. And I also think, though, we could add, I think combining question 2 with 4, meaning, so he always thinks of the banker as kind of, in some sense, the savior of the intermediary, right? He talks about in them being the intermediary to allow providing capital. But when banks fail, or when the banks are unable or have tightened credit, that is a way in which meaning the government can intervene to either loosen credit or provide an opportunity, provide banks to expand credit, right? So I'm curious if that's one way. It's not exactly how you phrase it in question 4, but when there's financial speculation so bad that it tightens credit, the banks are tightening credit so much that then you can put in this Keynesian perspective of adding government into the mix of monetary policy. How can this play a role? Now, I don't think Schumpeter ever even discusses government intervention in this perspective, but perhaps we can talk a little bit more on, is it not only how government intervenes for banks, but also in this credit and subsidies.
Mm.
There is this interesting part at the very end of the chapter, and it is about policy, right? It's saying that, and Schumpeter says that he wished to explain interest phenomenon, but not to justify it. Interest is a kind of tax on entrepreneur profit, and is not in itself particularly functional in a sense. So, although he, politically speaking, he was in favor of that kind of arrangement, from the pure economic perspective, he says that interest it might be done away with. Interest as a phenomenon is not a necessary part of development, and it can be much more easily changed than the other fundamental institutions of the competitive system. So this is how the chapter ends. So essentially, what Schumpeter is suggesting is that interest is not crucial. Interest, the phenomenon of interest might be eliminated, and this would not negatively affect development. In fact, since it would take away a tax on entrepreneur profit, this might be a good thing. And here Schumpeter is surprisingly Keynesian, because is discussing, although he's not in favor of it, but is essentially open to a euthanasia of the rentier.
Yeah, you're right. And I was thinking, yeah, he never discusses the entrepreneur as the capitalist that we so often see. Like, finally, are the capitalists the ones that are doing entrepreneurial ventures, right? So then you see this part of the population getting richer and richer from their own entrepreneurial activities, because they have the means to actually borrow themselves the money, right? Like a circular thing.
Right. But and there is a strong difference there, right? Because the entrepreneurial activity is an exceptional thing, in the sense that it is the exceptional entrepreneur that manages to get rich based on his own entrepreneurial activity, and this is explicitly discussed by Schumpeter, saying that it is very difficult to keep up entrepreneurial performance over time. And this is very different from interest, because once you have the monetary means, then and interest is an established phenomenon, then you can keep accruing returns to your monetary capital. And this is something that you can do in a stable way, and no entrepreneur can do that, because no entrepreneurial activity can be guaranteed to work well in the future. In fact, it's only a temporary return that the entrepreneur gains, and then to repeat the same deed, it is quite difficult. But there was also another thing I want to say on the speculation, since it was brought up by Mary before, and there is somewhere else, I think in Business Cycles, but I might be wrong. There is a very juicy note from Schumpeter saying that he personally welcomes, on the political and cultural and ethical grounds, he personally welcomes almost any measure against speculation. And in particular, he says it should be prohibited to members of a certain profession, meaning economists, to engage in speculation themselves. So this, aside from the obvious attack on Keynes, this is certainly a very strong personal stance. But notice that he never says on economic ground. They always say on ethic, moral and political grounds, not on economic grounds. So there is some space for debate on the usefulness of speculation.
Wait, can you repeat that? That he said that we should limit the amount of speculation.
No, we should, according to him, we should stamp it out, not limit.
Oh, okay.
It was very averse.
Seems possible.
Yeah, of course, and he said, of course, it would be damaging, but he personally welcomes almost any effort against it, no matter how damaging.
Huh.
So he was really, yeah, but it was an ethical, and moral, and political position rather than anything else. But since you asked about what did Schumpeter think about speculation, I thought it was interesting to bring it up.
Oh yeah, definitely, definitely. Mm. Well, I think we covered a lot of the questions, and it's a good maybe segue to talk into chapter 6, which I'm sure we'll also be able to loop back around and discuss things that are in chapter 5 as well. I mean, chapter 5 is pretty heavy, and I think a very important part of, a very important part of his overall theory. Brought together a lot of his different ideas, and from throughout all the chapters, we're finally building up to his overall ideas. So, Ben, would you like to begin to summarize chapter 6 and discuss that?
Sure. Thank you.
Let me.
I will try to do it in a quick way, just focusing on the basic or more interesting points. So again, the structure is similar to chapter 5 in the sense that it starts with a discussion of what he's not going to talk about and what the business cycle is not, rather than what the business cycle is. But it is interesting because, first of all, it makes it clear that he's advancing an endogenous theory of the business cycle, which is important for current debates, as we know. He's against the reading of the business cycle as a psychological phenomenon. He says the crisis can be accompanied by psychotic episodes, but they have no explanatory power. He says that even in another article dedicated to the subject, he says that even if by zoological miracle everyone would be turned into a bear, that would not create a crisis in itself. And then also, interestingly, and going against the Keynesian grain, so to speak, he says that business cycles were not monetary phenomena. So credit and monetary mechanisms are fundamental to understand them, but they are not the cause of it. So this is this separated quite neatly from other authors, especially, for example, Minskian theories of the cycle. And okay, so his theory is quite interesting because he identifies a positive cycle and a negative cycle. And I'm now sharing my screen, so that should be good. Okay, so a positive cycle, we should say a functional cycle, so a healthy cycle, a business cycle that has a function, that has a macroeconomic function that cannot be done away with. And in this sense, the business cycle is just a macroeconomic counterpart of the process of development. And interestingly, it works in a way that is a bit unexpected when read with modern eyes, because it is the success of the entrepreneur that brings the recession. But let's not go ahead of ourselves. First of all, the boom, or the prosperity, as it is called later on. The prosperity phase is created by the additional demand that is generated by the credit expansion that's supporting entrepreneurial activities. So in this phase, there is an expansion of incomes, of prices, of employment also, as it discusses in other contributions. And however, the innovation is still mostly invisible to the economy at large. So the innovators start to work, the entrepreneurs start to assemble what they need, and they start to operate, but the innovative products or services, process, or anything else, they are not visible yet in the economy. But the economy is expanding as a response to this temporary boost in demand. Okay, so this is the healthy prosperity in a sense. So it's simply a reaction of the economy to this added monetary demand through money creation by the banking sector. Then what happens is that the innovator is successful, as we said. So the successful innovator manages to enter the market finally with his own the new services, the new products, and he started to exert the competitive pressures on some parts of the incumbent industries, and also he starts to make money, of course, and repaying his or her debts. And therefore is actually doing this reflux mechanism, which means that the temporary boost in demand transforms in a temporary actually drag on demand, which takes, in a sense, the system by surprise. So the system now is reacting to innovation proper. Innovation was invisible to the system in the prosperity phase. In the recession phase, the system reacts to innovation. How it reacts? By shutting down certain parts due to competitive pressure, existing parts due to competitive pressures, by changing the structure of prices to accommodate to the changes brought by entrepreneurs, and also by stopping investing, since that boost in demand was indeed temporary. And therefore now it's going reverse. Now these two phases are negative, but they can be quite subdued. So they don't have to be dramatic. They don't have to be as damaging as the Great Depression and the Great Recession certainly were. So the question is, where does the crisis, the depression, and all the dramatic things came out? Well, according to him, they came out from a purely pathological phenomena that can start during this healthy business cycle. And it's a purely pathological phenomena that has no macroeconomic function, a macroeconomic meaning, is essentially prompted by the secondary waves, as they are discussed. And secondary waves are a monetary creation phenomenon. So they are additional episodes of money creation, therefore by the banking and in general the financial sector, to support additional expansion on the idea that the temporary boost in demand is actually a permanent or increasing boost in demand. And these secondary waves can take many forms, and they can happen, and there can be many of them at the same time. So, for example, in the Great Depression, but also in the Great Recession, we had, as we all know, a real estate bubble going on, so a mortgage bubble, so credit creation for the purpose of real estate support. But there can be many others. So there can be expansion of certain sectors with the idea that they will keep being useful in the future because of this increased vigor in the economy. So the economy is expanding so much that we need to prepare for a continuous expansion in the future, but this continuous expansion is not going to materialize. So this secondary phenomena, secondary waves can be large, much larger than the primary waves. So the primary creation phenomena can be quite small, and they can be dwarfed by these secondary waves. And essentially, they can lead to the crash, because the crash is amplified by these secondary waves. So when there is the turn from the prosperity to recession, it can end up in a crisis because of all these bad investments and therefore bad debts that have been accumulated before, and they are revealed as such during the term. Now, since there is this crisis, so there is a sudden crash of the system, and there are all these liquidity solvency spirals phenomena that starts, is debt deflation phenomena that I've described, for example, by Minskians today very well. And interestingly, they turn the recession, which is functional, into a depression that is completely pathological and completely destructive. So from a theoretical perspective, Schumpeter says there is no reason to expect the depression to never stop on its own, because this liquidity solvency debt deflation cycles has no natural, no theoretical stop to it, since the logic is based on a positive feedback and can keep grinding on until the economy is entirely destroyed. Of course, Schumpeter says this is very unlikely in practice because of a number of reactions to this that will tend to stop this spiral. But on a theoretical perspective, we need to recognize it as such. So at the end, what do we have? We have this interesting and rather original theory of the business cycle, which sees which also integrates a theory of the financial crisis and a theory of depression. And interestingly, it has also a policy dimension. And the policy dimension is quite simple. It's articulated around two separated principles. The first principle being the idea, of course, of intervention to contain all pathological phenomena. So as we said, the secondary waves first. So in the growing up phase, the secondary waves should be contained or eliminated. The crisis should, of course, be contained, and the depression should be stopped, because it's not going to stop on its own. So the first principle is a principle of broad and general intervention that covers before, during, and after the crisis. So much for the non-interventionist Schumpeter. And then the second principle that is even more interesting is the fact that the workers should be protected both in the benign and functional normal business cycle and in the abnormal destructive version, because they are never responsible for it. They are directed labor, so they take no part in any decision that is relevant for any phenomenon, any type of business cycle. And however, they tend to be the first victims, and therefore they need to be protected. So this principle justifies any sort of wage or employment policy, as specifically cyclical policy, counter-cyclical policies, to be clear. And therefore, employer last resort schemes that tend to be associated with Keynesians or Minsky, for example, nowadays, in fact, they are completely justified from a Schumpeterian perspective, because and notice that this is entirely separate from the first principle. So it doesn't matter that you are trying to avoid crisis or you're going to either be very active to contain the depression. Besides that, you still have to do something for the workers. Notice that Schumpeter does not go into the details of what should be done for the workers, so there is a lot of work to be done there. But it is interesting, because it's, like, again, one of the Schumpeterian points that are never discussed in Schumpeterian literature, at least today, or to my knowledge. It could be wrong. Now, I have certain discussion points that I would like to bring up, but perhaps this is a nice time to break down this lengthy exposition and allow people to engage in some questions.
Thank you, Ben. Yeah. So my question was the normal recession. So it's related to the creative destruction process in itself. But then this abnormal recession is caused by the money market. But then he said in the beginning that is not a monetary phenomenon. So how these two things interact?
Yes, that's a very good question. It's very helpful to explain this problem. Now, the normal business cycle, or let's say the baseline business cycle, is not a monetary phenomenon, right? Because it is linked to the process of development, which is not a purely monetary phenomenon. That was already described before, so I think that's quite easy at this stage. That's quite easy to follow. Now, the secondary wave. Oh, sorry, please.
No, yes, you're right. Sorry, I'm gonna move.
And the secondary waves, instead, as you said, originate in the money market, and they can be said to be purely monetary phenomena in themselves. Now, the argument is a little bit complex, because you can say, well, but the secondary waves are still nested into this underlying primary primary phenomenon. So at the end, it might be misguiding to say that they are purely monetary in nature. But I would say that once the discussion is made, so once the first point has been accepted, I think it is correct, and it has some benefits to say that the secondary waves and therefore the crisis and the depressions are monetary phenomena. And I think that would be correct. In fact, in some other contributions, Schumpeter says that this is the reason why so many authors describe the business cycles as purely monetary phenomena, because the secondary waves and the crisis and the depressions are so large, so relevant, so important to discuss, and they can be described entirely as monetary phenomena, and therefore so many people think the business cycle is all a monetary phenomenon. So I think you're right there. And I think once you make the distinction between a primary non-monetary phenomena and a secondary monetary phenomena, I think everything is fine and dandy. However, you start if you have a Keynesian in the room, they will start to scream at you.
Any Canadians here? No.
It happened to me.
That's surprising because we've had a lot of actually really interesting discussions with Schumpeterians, Canadians, or Canadians that have joined in on the conversation on this topic. Actually, I think speaking on that was interesting to see is how the employer of last resort schemes fits in naturally, because I had never, before reading this, I had never thought of that in the Schumpeterian perspective. I always assigned it to a Keynesian perspective, and it's nice to finally get at the end of the book the policy recommendations, or what we can, or what is possible in the, or thought of, what Schumpeter thinks of policy recommendations. But there wasn't any, typically when we think of Schumpeterian policy, and going back to Carmen's really good question about government intervention on credit and subsidies for innovation entrepreneurship, he never directly addresses that, to my understanding, but please correct me if I'm wrong. So to see that when we think of Schumpeterian policy, we often think of it purely on the basis of how to spur innovation or entrepreneurship. But in this case, the way that I see it here is much more broader. So maybe if you want to comment or expand a little bit on that.
Yes, thank you, Mary. This is interesting, and it's important to keep up the discussion that we had before on this. And I think essentially you're right. Schumpeter does not discuss the involvement of the state at all here, and in general, the state is the missing part of Schumpeterian theory. There is some there, and if you dig, you find some interesting things, but it's certainly not obvious. However, what can be said on the basis of this book, because we're discussing on this book today, is that if you put together what he says at the end of chapter 5, and also the discussion of policy intervention at chapter 6, what you end up is the following. Well, if you want to, it depends what you want to do. If you want to foster innovation, and that's it, so your objective is to foster innovation, then direct intervention of the government might not be the best way to do it. Although there is a discussion, but it depends on the monetary conditions and the conditions of the money market at the time. However, perhaps some cyclical intervention of the government to finance innovation might be good, because when he discusses the impact of the secondary waves on innovation, this, however, happens mostly in business cycles, he says this is very, very damaging. So the entrepreneurs get screwed like everyone else by the secondary waves. So there is an angle for a anti-cyclical involvement of the government in innovation policy, especially funding it. However, if you want to go this, if you want to engineer a Schumpeterian euthanasia of the rentier, let's say that you share Keynesian values. This was not the case of Schumpeter, as we know, but let's say that you do. Then the best way to starve the beast for Schumpeter would not be to engineer very stable long-term bond interest rates, like Keynes was trying to do, but to have a stable, effective, and large-scale funding of entrepreneurial activities by the government. This would essentially take out that primary source of money for paying interest, according to his theory, and therefore eventually and indirectly put the squeeze on the rentier. So depending on what is exactly your scope, so if you only care about innovation, or if you care about social engineering, or at least redistribution from the rentier to the worker, then you end up with quite different policy recommendations, as you said.
But then, how? Maybe I'm misreading the link, but how then is that innovation connected to development? From my understanding, is that innovation can help lead to development, and I understand that is some qualitative form of increased development. But if you invest in innovation, does that then lead to development, or can, let's say, lead to development?
Generally, the economic development in Schumpeterian terminology refers to the innovative process. Okay, so the process of integration of innovation in the economic system. But economic development is not what we term economic growth. So you need to have that distinction in mind.
Absolutely, yeah. But I guess maybe what I'm trying to get at is, well, maybe we can talk a little bit more about then. I understand that there's a difference in a Schumpeterian sense of development, which is not growth. But is there of development? Does that necessarily mean general better outcomes for individuals, like economic agents and actors within it? Because I mean, it creates new demand, but there's no real discussion about whether that demand necessarily leads to better outcomes for not just workers, but for the like a Pareto optimal better outcome is what I'm trying to get at.
Of course. Essentially, some agents are going to be better off at the end of this process. And yes, he also says that eventually, if you make a general statement, right, at the purely abstract level, you can say that there would be a Pareto. Let's say Pareto would be happy on the terms of this improvement, right? So there could be potential compensation, all that. But at the same time, when you move instead to the empirical level, which is what you care mostly about, because we don't live in the abstract side, you have to keep in mind that the process of innovation is always going to generate gains and losses, all right? And although the gains might be superior to the losses, the distribution of the gain and losses might be extremely skewed and certainly not uniform across society. And therefore, once you take that into account, perhaps your perception of the positive impact of development might change. Now, here is describing things at an abstract and theoretical level, and therefore this issue does not come up. But having to live in the world and having to make a decision about is innovation good or bad, or should we have more innovation, or should we have different innovation? Well, this issue is relevant, and the main issue here is what are the financial and monetary mechanisms associated to funding innovation, and especially to generate the entrepreneurial profits or entrepreneurial gains, and who is going to appropriate those gains? And these are the important questions because you don't know who is going to lose, because that's dependent on the, let's say, technological but also sociological shape of the specific innovation. But the financial form can be stable, right? This is about the permanent returns that are interest against the temporary returns to this entrepreneurship. And so if we have, like today, a concentration of returns in the financial system in the form of capital gains, then you're going to have economic development without economic growth, but with a lot of financialization, with a lot of growth in the value of financial assets.
I think that, for what I understood after reading the book is that development for Schumpeter seems to be in the innovation process and entrepreneurial process that happens in the economy. And yeah, from chapter 5, it's the entrepreneurial profit will spread through the economy through the interest as a revenue from credits. But it doesn't say how the distribution will be. And given that for him, it seems that the entrepreneur or the innovator is a different type of person, right? It's the workers, entrepreneurs, and the capitalists. So probably, yeah, if the entrepreneurs takes more of the benefit and the rest, how it distributes, it doesn't say anything about that. So maybe, yeah, there is a scope to discuss that.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I don't think in anywhere in the way that after reading the book, the way that he seems to describe it is more about how he thinks is a general theory of economic development, but meaning a how economic processes work, and also in that embedded is how he thinks about it in reflection to the circular flow of the economy, right? Because I feel like he's always kind of going back to his chapter 1 that describes it and going back to saying, okay, where they got it wrong or right. But again, in the circular flow, as well as in the kind of the contemporary economics, in the macroeconomic models, we don't ever really discuss or have not really focused. We have in the past, but not currently, I should say, in the macro models, how distribution affects change the macroeconomic dynamics, or even, let's say, demand, if you want to go back to a Keynesian perspective, but how there's no discussion on wage distribution or any kind of monetary distribution. And I'm specifically thinking about income inequality in mind, or any kind of role of how, not at least in my understanding of how wages play a role in all of this. Wages of the worker are mostly not discussed. It's about capital, interest on capital, and how entrepreneurs utilize these things to push forward development. But I don't know, maybe if you want to discuss a little bit more about that, but I think that's a really good point, Carmen, that there's not much discussion about distribution at all in his in the book.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking before about if the entrepreneurs and the capitalists and the owners of business are the same persons, then we could understand that maybe why there's accumulation of capital in those particular persons within the economy versus the workers. But I'm not sure. Maybe it's going very far or from Schumpeter. I don't know.
Hi, Allison here. I'm now sitting next to Mary because my mic is not working. But actually, I wanted to come back to a point that Mary raised earlier, but I'm wondering how it fits in with this discussion and the previous one of the how Schumpeter views the role of banks in this. And he seems, at least to me, but maybe I'm not getting it fully, that he perceives banks as honest brokers. So there doesn't seem to be much room for exploitation on the part of the banks. So, and just wondering if that's A, an accurate interpretation, and B, if this is maybe where he diverges from what we see today.
On this topic, I think that's a very interesting question. Of course, it is a matter of perspective, as I said, the value we put here on what the banks are actually doing. But if we just stay at the theoretical level and how it describes the banks and so forth, essentially, what are the banks doing? The banks come into being with development because the phenomenon of interest come into being in development, and therefore this productive lending come into being with development, and they act as a tax on it. So they enable it, but they enable it in order to gain their income from this process. So it is you can say, well, they enable development, therefore they provide a service, but in fact this service can be arranged in a different way, and they provide the service only because otherwise they could not exist. So are they parasitic entities, or are they honest brokers? Are they providing a good service? We can say that in the Schumpeterian theory, they are not necessary. And in fact, he advocated the nationalization of the banking system, the British banking system in countries of socialism and democracy as an effective economic instrument. So, and if we put together is a strong dislike for speculation, well, he probably would not be very, very happy with the present day banking system as it is. And in fact, I would argue that there is a strong Schumpeterian case for nationalization of the banking system of today.
Yeah, with respect the other forms of financing entrepreneurship and innovation, then he mentions, right, a little bit of the credit. So we could think of like the government giving the credit that banks are not giving to entrepreneurs and innovators. But what I want to ask you, you consider that maybe at the end of the book, it is possible to make a Schumpeterian case for considering innovation policies as part of macroeconomic policy in terms of contracyclical programs. What do you think?
That's a tough one, in the sense that, okay, we have seen that there is a scope for some policies that we would call countercyclical, right? In the sense that there is a scope for intervention to contain all these secondary waves, so excessive booms, crisis, depression, all that. Could it be done through at least partially through innovation policies? Yes, they could be done through innovation policies. I think that case can be made. At the same time, here we are not in Keynes, right? So for Keynes, the entire business cycle is a psychological and pathological phenomenon, and we should engineer a semi-permanent boom, right? That was the entire point there. Instead, for Schumpeter, you have to keep the natural business cycle going. That is necessary. So the counter-cyclical policies should exist, and there is a scope for that, and they might integrate some, let's subsidize the innovators. However, keep in mind that this is very much anti-rentier, okay, in shape. So you should do that only if you're okay or you are willing to limit financial income, which, today perhaps it is something that should be done. But at the same time, you should not be so counter-cyclical as to try to engineer stable, positive, linear growth over time. That would be throwing the baby with the bathwater, I think, according to Schumpeter.
So in the last 10 minutes, I want to open up a discussion that is a little bit, not everyone would know about this, or everyone knows about it but have not read about it, which he keeps and I think it's worth mentioning at some point during the webinar, which I've chosen the last 10 minutes of our entire series to mention, is that there is a difference between the first version and the second version. And the first version is young Schumpeter, and the second version is a jaded, older Schumpeter, and the older version is the one that we're reading because it's in English. The first version is in German. But even in this version, he consistently mentions, first of all, in the introduction, if you have a chance to read it, but even in the beginning of chapter 5 and throughout the different chapters, where he's kind of edited, where he hasn't, where he's kind of still in strong support. So I think it's worth an honorable mention and maybe discussion for those who know the differences or have read. I've only read some summary that was provided earlier in the first webinar, and there's also a few papers written about this that discuss the differences, what they are, and in what viewpoint. So we know it's between old and young and kind of lessons learned that he had faced throughout. And reading this, he's in strong defense on his chapter 5 that apparently he got some strong criticism from at some point. But if we could just kind of end our seminar series on a discussion between the two versions, or even through your reading in this version, where he's highlighted what you've seen, what do you think that he's kind of why he was highlighting the stuff that he talked about in the different changes. So I'll kind of leave it open to you all to discuss this. Perhaps I'll point out to Ben, who I know has knows a little bit about this.
Yes. Well, on this, Mary, you touch a nerve, I think, because I entirely disagree with this Mark 1, Mark 2 distinction. After reading, well, the vast majority of what Schumpeter has written, I don't find any strong evidence for that. In fact, I was so surprised that I tried to track down where this Mark 1, Mark 2 came from. And it is something that came out in the early 80s. And before that time, no commentator ever suggested that. In particular, the people who were working with Schumpeter and the early Schumpeterians who died off in the 50s, but they still were active after his death, they never, ever, ever provide a reading of Schumpeter that divides his thought in a Mark 1, Mark 2. So I can say that yes, there is some evolution. Yes, that there are some changes, especially in exposition. But I think that the crucial point are all the same, and I think there are some misreadings of, for example, the changes in the capitalist regime. And I think that's the main problem that led to this Mark 1, Mark 2 thing. So essentially, Schumpeter described the same theory in two different institutional settings. And one is the competitive capitalism, we got it here. And one is the justified capitalism, and we got it in bits and pieces all over the place in the 30s and 40s contributions, but we are going to see something also in capitalist socialism and democracy. And yes, they're different. No, they do not reflect changing minds, cynicism, or what have you. They are simply the same theory applied to different institutional contexts. Now, that's my reading. I know it's, but there are some very good articles making the same point by people that have way more titles than I do. So I would just refer to that. If someone is interested, they can drop me a mail and I can send us some of these intriguing references.
Yeah, I think you expanded greater on the. I think this is a big debate among the literature, at least modern literature, on Mark 1, Mark 2. But I was actually, and I'm glad you commented on that, but I was actually in reference to this book and the version of 1911 to the current version that we're reading, which is what, 1924 or something? Or later, 1928, 29? In the sense that
I went on an unrelated rant. Okay.
Yeah.
I understand. Sorry. Sorry for the rant.
I'm glad you did mention it because I had avoided that discussion, but but I was kind of, which it's fine. I just wanted to point out because the history of economic thought had brought up this point, and also my advisor, that there, you should read, really insisting that we should read the German version as well. But unfortunately, I do not speak fluent German or read it, so I was unable to do so. But there are translations, and there are a couple differences from what I read on the people who have written about this, which is one, that there's an additional chapter, chapter 7, that he completely scraps from this new version. And the other is that his definition of the entrepreneur had changed in this version from previous versions. And he insists also on how, in the book itself, he tells how he's changed things. And even in the introduction, he's like, I'm not going to go through, he's like, I'm not going to go through all the edits, but I made some significant changes and cut things out. So I think I just kind of wanted to insist and make a mention of that. There are some resources on our event page, Facebook event page that have a deeper discussion on that. But if those who have read or know a little bit about the differences on the first version, which he wrote when he was young, versus the older version, which he wrote when he was older, and this version was edited. He was translated and edited into English, I think, by him, but for sure, it's the English translation, and he edited this translation, this version, to, I guess, more properly identify his theory. And in fact, he talked about, things that had changed. So in chapter 2, for example, he talked about examples that happened in 1919 when he wrote his first book, was written prior to this. So I wanted to kind of give a general overview, and I'm not really qualified for that, but at least to mention that importance, that there are differences in the version, which highlight impact in showing how how he was stubborn in some things and how his mind changed in other perspectives. There is an English translation on the last chapter available, if you're interested, you can contact us just mention on our Facebook page, or message us, and we can provide to you. That is quite interesting, and frankly, I have not read it. I just read this version of the book.
I would recommend to read that extra chapter. The translation is excellent. It's been provided by Biondi recently, and the chapter goes into the relevance of accounting. Well, okay, we are losing the crowd here, but it goes also into the differences between capital, debt, and wealth, according to Schumpeterian theory. And there are some very interesting passages. Some of them can be found also in his book on money, his unpublished book on money, that has been recently published in English as well. But that chapter is quite good, so I would heartily recommend. On the changes from between the two versions, I would say that they are not as substantial as they can be made to be. In fact, Schumpeter edited this version, and he said that he tried to keep it as close as possible to the original. Some changes exist. The debate exists as well. But perhaps the people here would like to make up their own mind, and I would encourage them to try their hand at the German version too.
That is if you read German. Yes, well, I think I will wrap up our final webinar series. I want to thank Carmen Contreras for her excellent discussion and notes and questions that were made this last seminar really interesting for us, and also to Dr. Beniamino Callegari for his contribution on Chapter 6 and his questions. Thank you all for participating in our series, the Readings Schumpeter. We've completed the book. It's been a really interesting journey with all of you. I've had many different kind of perspectives, and I've personally really enjoyed it, and I hope that you found this an enjoyable experience as well. I wish you very happy holidays and happy New Year, and hopefully see you for another future webinar series on reading Schumpeter.
Thank you, Mary, for everything.